Welcome to Arise with Christ. We share stories and truths related to the temple. Together with you, our hope is to fortify faith in Jesus Christ and experience joy in covenant keeping.
I'm Carolee Bailey, and I'm here with Anjali Plojek. We are so grateful to have you here joining us at Arise with Christ. We know that there are so many choices about how to spend your time and about what to listen to. We really appreciate you spending time here with us. We hope you feel uplifted by being here.
If you enjoy this episode of Arise with Christ, we hope that you will share it with your friends and family. We would also love for you to subscribe to Arise with Christ and leave us a review.
Our guest is Dr. Jason Whiting. We're so grateful for the chance to learn from him and spend time with him. He incorporates true principles of the gospel into his academic work and makes clear the things that bless and strengthen families.
Jason Whiting researches the love lives of couples, focusing on how deception and conflict take root in even the best of relationships. His goal is to apply social science to help couples to be more loving and authentic. You can read more about this in his book, Love Me True. Dr. Whiting received his PhD from Michigan State University and is a licensed marriage and family therapist. He has won awards for his research and writing and is currently a professor in the School of Family Life at Brigham Young University.
Thanks for having us, Jason. We wanted to ask you initially about your book. Your book is called Love Me True. Would you give us a little bit of an overview about your book? And after that, I want to follow that up with a question related to the Temple Recommend questions.
Yeah, I started realizing over the course of time working with families, both as a therapist as well as a researcher, and of course in my own family and everywhere else, that it seemed like most of the problems people would run into were related to being false in some way, whether that's blaming or making excuses or exaggerating or minimizing. And so it just seemed to me such a central problem for relationships. And I got thinking about that and thinking about the way we kind of are biased or self-deceiving. And then I started studying things like unhealthy, controlling, abusive relationships. And it was even more obvious, more apparent that people, when the relationships that become more severe and more unhealthy, the deception becomes more obvious. Just as one example, somebody might be hurtful to someone else, even physically, and then blame that person for what they did. They said, I wouldn't have done this if you would have only stopped nagging me or if you would have had the place clean or whatever. I mean, the excuses just became more and more blatant and kind of ridiculous. So anyway, it just seemed to me to be this really central struggle for families. And as I thought about it, I just got energy around it and started looking into it and thought, this is worth spending some time on.
Well, definitely. And I enjoyed your book. And it was interesting to me to realize how much it brought to my own mind, my questioning my own motives in situations and thinking, okay, am I deceiving myself here?
Right.
How can I be more true? So I've really benefited from that. I've been grateful.
Well, that's another reason I think I was interested in it, because I'm like, oh, of course, I do that at times too. You know, when you have a conversation with somebody like your spouse and you're saying, hey, this thing hurt my feelings, or when we have this thing come up, each person will remember it differently. They'll kind of re-represent it differently. They'll represent their own motives as more noble or better than they might have been.
Sure.
And the other person's motives as, well, you were just trying to be mean and I was just trying to do my best, that kind of thing. So I just think it's a universal struggle, part of life.
Yeah, that's what was so interesting to me as well, thinking initially, well, I don't ever deceive my husband.
Right.
And then reading into it and realizing, oh, there are ways that I could approach a situation differently or communicate differently. And it was very eye-opening. I really enjoyed that.
Oh, good. This was recently, I read a quote from, there's an author, his name is Richard Rohr. He's a Jesuit priest that writes a lot about relationships. And it's really interesting. And he quoted someone, this is a theologian from Germany. And the quote is something like this: the natural habitat for truth is in intrapersonal relationships. I thought about that for a second. I thought the reason why I like that is because truth is not just about the sky is blue and what I said is literally true. It's this bigger quest for authenticity, for accuracy, for taking responsibility, all these things we experience in our interpersonal relationships. And they're hard sometimes. Like, again, let's say we get upset or we get our feelings hurt or we behave badly and we have a hard time admitting that. So I just think seeking for authenticity and saying, you know what, I could have done better, or help me really understand your perspective. not that I'm waiting for my turn to speak. I really do want to understand where you're at, because that will help me understand the big picture. Those are all quests for truth. And that's not always easy to do, especially when we're in an immature mode, or we're tired, or we feel like we've been wronged or whatever. It's just hard. And I think it's a lifetime quest.
Definitely. Well, and thinking about your research and writing that book, the Temple Recommend question that came to my mind was the one that says, do you follow the teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ in your private and public behavior with members of your family and others?
Yeah.
And I thought that was kind of an interesting connection.
Sure. And I will say, again, as a therapist, sometimes, and as a researcher of domestic violence, sometimes I see some really ugly examples of people who in the church at times are putting forward this front of like, hey, it's all good, and don't you dare say anything that would make other people think less of us. Like they punish family members for being honest, essentially. And so that question is really good if somebody's willing to answer it honestly. But I think sometimes people who are in that kind of deceptive mode are going to be deceptive even to church leaders at times about things like that. And I hear those stories too, unfortunately. So those are more the exception than the rule, but that's an invitation for us to reflect about, am I really being who I want to be? Am I living consistent with my values, both out in the world and at home?
Well, and it also made me reflect more on the question regarding honesty. Do you strive to be honest in all that you do? Where is that honesty and authenticity? It's being honest with ourselves and reflecting on what our own motives and purposes are.
It's a big question. Again, I remember hearing, this was a Truman Madsen lecture decades ago, and he said that he would often hear people, or even some of his church leader friends would hear people say, in response to that question, I try. And that's a fair response, because I think it's hard to say, yes, I'm 100% honest in every single thing in my life, if you think about it in this bigger sense of integrity and having good motives, and not just about, well, yeah, I'm literally honest in what I say. I don't go out and lie, cheat, steal, have affairs, whatever. I just think it's a big topic.
But am I being self-serving or selfish?
Yeah.
So thinking about that, I was thinking about your research into relationships, and also as a father of young adults, that they're in this season of life of seeking companions. Some have already found their companions, and some are still in that process. And I just was interested in what your counsel is to them, or, in a broader view, maybe to your students even. What counsel do you give to young adults who are seeking to have an authentic relationship that's based on the gospel of Jesus Christ?
It's funny, the young man who married my daughter, Eli, who came to me and said, Jane and I have been dating and I'd like permission. It was really great. And I knew him and he's a great guy. So I had to think about that question. What advice? And of course, he's great and Jane's great and they're doing well. But one thing we did talk about was some of this ideas about honesty and being the kind of person that you would want to be married to. And also, maybe less in relation to them because they had known each other for years. But in general, I would say you do need to get to know somebody well enough to know their character, to know their heart, to know that it's more than just this kind of fun and exciting thing. But do you know how they handle challenges? Do you know how they treat other people? Do you know how they treat their own families? Are they honest? Do they take, related to this idea of honesty, and I do talk about this in the book some, is accountability. And that's sort of this self-honesty of, I should have done something different yesterday than I did. Or when I said that to you, I can tell that that was the wrong thing to say. Or I need to reflect. It's the opposite of defensiveness, where it's like excuses and not taking responsibility. So I have, people reflect on those kinds of things, the ideas about honesty, accountability. There's some other things. Since I wrote that book, I've been doing this project at BYU on relationships. And so we've been interviewing people all over the country and a few people outside of the country about just what works and what doesn't. So we've been trying to focus on principles of healthy versus unhealthy. Two of which are the things we were just talking about. Honesty is healthy and dishonesty, not so much. Accountability is healthy. Defensiveness, excuses, not very healthy. And people have all kinds of different experiences with this. But there are a couple of others that are relevant to what do you look for in a spouse. One is respect. Do they treat you as a person of dignity, of worth? Or do they become snarky and aggressive and mean and that kind of thing? It sounds really basic, but it still surprises me, even after doing this for decades, that there are people who treat their friends one way, but don't treat their spouses the same way. Like they're more quick to be rude or say things that are just hurtful to their family members. So that's a key piece, right? Just that respect. Another of these patterns or principles that we look at is commitment. Are they into the relationship? This goes along with the idea of covenants, which I know you guys talk about a lot. But do they see the relationship as something that's sacred and to be protected, and that they're not going to betray their spouse, like by talking badly about them or going outside the relationship in other ways? And the last one would probably be what we would call fairness or humility, that both of our perspectives are legitimate and not just it's always about me. One of the things you'll see in unhealthy relationships is this idea of not accepting influence, which means I don't really care what your version is. Mine's the most important. I don't care that your mom's coming over to visit. I already have my plans. Whereas in a healthy version, people will say, oh, okay, that's what you want. It's different than what I would want. So let's talk about it. Let's both be kind of open to this is how you celebrate Christmas, or this is where we go out for a date. So those are just some of the kinds of healthy things I would want people to look for.
So what advice do you have for somebody that might find themselves in a relationship where they are noticing maybe some of these, can we call them red flags?
Yeah, part of it depends on what stage the relationship is at. If it's early on, hopefully they can talk about that and see if, again, that other person is open to talking an issue through. And do they feel like they were heard? Sometimes people are hurtful or unhealthy and not realizing it. There are people who are just more awkward in relationships, for example. Maybe they just have less experience. They might say something that they don't think is problematic and the other person might be hurt. It's also true, and this is a tricky issue, that some people have certain sensitivities and they get hurt by something that might not hurt most people. And so this gets really tricky when we talk about things like abuse or emotional abuse, because it's hard to disentangle that. But it's a good question. What they can do, for starters, is just try to address it in their relationship and talk things through and do it in a respectful way, do it in a patient way. And if both parties are able to be heard and they feel like, okay, what can we do about this? That's a good sign. That goes back to that accountability thing. If they're not, and if they're saying, I don't care, that's your problem, that's not a good sign, right? If they're like not willing to take a look at what they've done. That becomes a really tricky question after marriage, right? Because people have entered into and have said, hey, we're committed. We're in this for the long haul. So at that point, I would say, if conversations aren't getting you anywhere, then professional help is hopefully an option and hopefully can be helpful. And I've seen it be really helpful. I've also seen it not be helpful. It really depends on where the people are at. And of course, they can also go to ecclesiastical help and other things like that. But I do think sometimes we ask our ecclesiastical leaders for maybe things that they might not be equipped to handle if it's getting to be that sort of abusive, unhealthy situation. And I'm not trying to take away from the idea of going to ecclesiastical leaders or Relief Society presidents or whatever, because I think that's helpful. But it's situations that even for those of us that study it all the time, these can be really difficult situations.
You mentioned the aspect of covenants in relationships and in family relationships. What is it that you have observed or learned about covenant keepers in relationships and how that strengthens a family?
When I thought about covenants, I thought about a couple of things. One, there's research on this idea of how people enter into relationships and the difference that makes long term. And it's sometimes referred to as sliding versus deciding. In other words, some people slide into a relationship just kind of without a lot of thought. They're like, well, we're dating and let's move in together. Might as well save money. That's different than dating, taking time, and waiting till marriage, for example, for intimacy and things like that. And that's covenant versus like sliding versus deciding, is taking the time to really get to know the person and make that kind of level of a commitment, a covenant, which is lifelong. So a couple things happen when you do that. One, the research says that when people just kind of jump in relationships early, sliding, those are less stable relationships. And it goes a little bit against what someone's common sense might say, which they would say, well, you got to try out the relationship to see if it's going to work, right? Just like you would go test drive a car, and they would say, well, this, surely you're not going to just go jump into and wait and save yourself for marriage if you don't know if it's going to be good. But again, the research would say that actually doesn't hold, because what happens is people get in those relationships, and then if they're kind of in halfway, there's always this sense of, well, I don't really love this, maybe I'm out. Mm-hmm. Those relationships tend to have a higher rate of conflict and domestic violence, just as one example. when you make a covenant, when you get into a marriage, you set up different kinds of expectations. You put boundaries around the relationship. And so when somebody's in and they've said, I do and I'm in, then suddenly, hopefully, they think of things like conflict differently. They're like, well, we've had this struggle, but we're not just throwing out the marriage. We're in this, and so we'll work it out. Or I'm going to treat this relationship a little differently, a little better because it's my long-term relationship. Does that make sense? It's like, it sets these bounds around it to where people perceive it and treat it a little bit differently, hopefully. And that's from a secular perspective. And of course, when you add the spiritual dimension of an eternal marriage covenant in a temple, that's different as well, because it also adds that additional layer of commitment and perspective.
So I'm interested in something that you just said. You mentioned the secular and the spiritual. And I think it's interesting what you do as a BYU professor, that you are seeking to pursue the secular knowledge about family studies and also the spiritual component. So could you talk about that for just a minute, kind of what that's like in your professional life, the secular and spiritual aspects?
Yeah, on the one hand, it's a real blessing that my career is one that is of personal significance to me from a doctrinal and a cultural perspective. When I was younger, people were interesting, relationships were interesting. And then, of course, there's that element of I'm a church member, and we know doctrinally that families are eternal. We came from a heavenly family. We are in families. And so that all is really significant. And even the project that I just mentioned to you, studying healthy and unhealthy patterns in marriage, that is in part informed by, there's a phrase from the Family Proclamation, and I've got it here. It says, you'll be familiar with this: families are established and maintained on principles of faith, prayer, repentance, forgiveness, respect, love, compassion, work, and wholesome recreational activities. That kind of idea about principles is relevant because, like I said, I'm looking for these patterns. Families are complicated, people are complicated, and so you can't just give somebody a 10-step recipe for a perfect marriage. Do this, do this, do this. Or for parenting, when your kid talks back, do this, right? Because kids, as you know, each kid is different, each parent is different, each situation is different. So I think that idea of principles has informed the way I think about, professional principles in my work in marriage. And sometimes, as a therapist, for example, sometimes things related to sacred things come up. But even if they don't come up explicitly, they're still kind of there in the way that I think. And I think that's relevant. Actually, and I just thought of one other example related to covenants and spiritual things. I worked with a woman once, this was years ago, who really had come from a traumatic background, struggled a lot with just depression, feelings of self-worth. There had been a lot of abuse in her experiences growing up. She struggled with depression and being suicidal, and her poor Relief Society presidents were like, we want to help her, but we're overwhelmed. We don't know what to do. So I would be in contact with them. So I worked with her on and off for some years, actually. And then one day, I don't remember even why I asked her this, but I said, how has your relationship with Jesus made a difference? And she broke down. She started to cry. I remember this really vividly. And she said, I'm still alive because of that. Like her experience with the atonement was at such a level that I think I don't even appreciate, because you see that sometimes with people who've had traumas or addictions. They've had to turn to the atonement in a way that maybe many of us haven't had to rely on. And for her, that was so important. And for us to be able to have that conversation was really neat. And I've had cool spiritual conversations with members of other faiths and things like that as well. But it's neat to be able to kind of hold both of those perspectives of professional and personal when you're working with people, because that's their lives. You're talking about some very deep and personal things.
Yeah, that must be a really interesting position, particularly as a therapist, to have people share such intimate parts of their life with you. And I can imagine hearing some troubling and maybe horrible things sometimes too, that for you personally, you have to probably rely on the Savior to help you process some of that, I would imagine. Is that?
Yeah, that's true. And I think one of my challenges as a trainer of therapists, as a professor, is to help these young therapists in training learn how to do that as well. Because you're right. When you get into a room with someone and they're sharing difficult, traumatic things. And in fact, I was meeting with a student the other day. She walked in and she said, I'm just really angry right now. And I said, what's going on? She said, I just came from this session and these people they just wouldn't stop going after each other. And it's hard. And she's like, I'm trying to slow them down. And it wasn't working. So two things happen there. One is that, yeah, it can be really challenging to see people who are struggling with painful things, especially when you see kids who are in bad situations where there's been, sexual abuse or neglect or violence or emotional abuse. That's really heartbreaking stuff. And hats off to the people who are out there in the trenches, working in like child protective services or foster care agencies. And so you have to learn how to just be loving and do the best you can, and then know that that is what you can do. And sometimes ultimately, I remember one of my professors saying this at BYU when I was in training. He said, these are sometimes when I think about the millennium and someday when all those tears will be dried and, people will be healed. Another thing that happens, which is challenging, especially for these young therapists, is they get into the room with people, oftentimes because we're here in Utah County, they're church members, and they bump up against the realities that just because somebody's a church member doesn't necessarily mean they're living up to these standards like we're all trying to do. Of course, none of us do perfectly, but some people really struggle. And so sometimes they see what they feel like is hypocrisy, or like, I worked with this guy and he's a bishop, but he's terrible to his teenagers, or those kinds of things. And I'll say, look, people are people and God works through imperfect people. It's all he's ever had to work with. Like Elder Holland has said, it must be terribly frustrating to him, but he deals with it. So that is the reality of it. And if you get caught up in the imperfections of people in the church culture, then yeah, you're going to struggle. You have to find your own strength in build your testimony through your relationship with the Savior. You have to find those divine experiences with the scriptures or with going to the temple or with your own covenants to be able to also then hold these messy things about life or even doctrine or church history or whatever it is you can't quite sort out. That's okay. That's just part of life. And that's why I think faith is the first principle, right? Because we always have to keep choosing that. So anyway, those are just some of the ways that I think about that question of helping me and others work in this kind of profession. It is a very different kind of profession than, being an accountant or something like that, where you're just focusing on kind of a secular, straightforward thing. And there are days that I think, man, I think I should go be a microbiologist or something else, because
work in a lab away from people.
Yeah. And I still, after all these years, I still haven't figured out best practices, or people are, I don't know if what I did was helpful. And then there's other days where you're like, that was awesome. And it's all what you would want it to be. It was really this great relationship and somebody really benefited. But you just get that whole mix. You just do.
Thank you for speaking to that. I think that's really interesting. I think it's helpful for people to hear your perspective from the broad exposure you've had to various relationships through research and also personal interaction.
And it's inspiring to me to hear you talk about utilizing the atonement, just like the people that you might be counseling or hopefully trying to use the atonement in their life. We all draw on that, and we all need to be filled and healed by that in different and various ways.
I think so. I think healing can come in a lot of different ways, but ultimately spiritual healing is its own kind of thing. And interesting that you've mentioned that. When I was a master's student here at BYU in the mid-90s, Wendy Watson Nelson was one of my professors. And she said what you just said. Similarly, she said, ultimate healing comes through the atonement. We can be healers and we can help people find peace. But there's a different kind of healing that happens that way. And, like I said earlier, some people I think really appreciate that ways deeper than what I can appreciate because they've needed to go to that, that valley of death, really difficult place to overcome some really tough stuff.
I'm interested, Jason, in hearing a little bit about your personal journey along the covenant path that's brought you to this point in your life now. What did you experience in your childhood and young years, and what brought you to where you are now?
Sure. And I think in some ways it's kind of a generic story, which is probably okay because a lot of people probably have those kind of generic stories, in that I grew up in the church. I started in Idaho, and so church members, while they weren't a majority, people were familiar with the church and it just didn't come up that much. Then I moved to Ohio when I was 15 and moved to Cincinnati. And so I will say that's maybe where I first started bumping up against people who were like, what the heck? You're a Mormon? What even, they thought I was Amish or they didn't know anything about it. And one of those guys was like, your dad have a beard? And And so I remember one job I had in high school. I would drive around the city delivering things with another kid who was the son of the boss. And he had this fancy Maserati, and he would smoke and he would curse, and he'd be like, come on, just swear one time, Jason, what's your deal? And I'd be like, dude, that's not where I'm at. And he and others would kind of challenge me on things that I then had to kind of start digging a little bit and saying, okay, where am I at with all this stuff? And that was good. I took seminary at 5:40 in the morning. That was also not easy. And I had to think, am I really in this for the right reasons? I will say, though, that even though I was back and forth and my faith was probably not great, I could see that there was something pretty cool about the whole, like return missionaries, for one example. You could see there's something different there. And so even though I didn't really get it, I was like, okay, I got to go figure out what that is. And so, long story short, my mission was one of those places where suddenly I had to really dig deep into scriptural things, face challenges from people who were enemies, had read stuff about the church, and that I had to then go reflect on and be like, wow, I hadn't heard that. I got to go think about this. But I started having experiences with the scriptures that were different than I had ever had. And it's not like you have to go on a mission to do this, but a mission sets up a structure to spend time and to have the motivation to really get into the scriptures. And I remember once with one of my kids, when she was talking to us from the MTC, and she said, I've been reading the Book of Mormon a lot. She's like, there's some gems in there. And this struck me because I remember that exact same experience at the MTC, like, wow, this is really cool. And it's sitting with me, not just in an intellectual sense, but I come away from it motivated and like excited. And that has continued. When I'm doing better with my scriptures, that's my experience. And so even if I have these other questions or whatever, I can go back there and be like, that makes me feel differently. That makes me be a different person when I'm immersing myself in the scriptures. And I'm an academic. I like scholarship. And so I like things like gospel scholarship, where they go and analyze like Book of Mormon author word prints or historical parallels. That stuff is really fascinating, but it ultimately isn't the source of what makes me feel like I'm a better person by reading the scriptures. Another thing I will say too about my journey as an adult, for a long time being out in the Midwest, and then we've lived in other places, I wasn't as close to a temple. And, I'd go to temples and had some good experiences. But as I've gotten older and I've lived closer to temples, and then with President Nelson's focus on the temple, I've gone more often. And since I know you both have talked a lot about covenants, I was thinking about this. And my temple experiences have been similar, which are, it's not an intellectual thing. I go and, it's not about even what I'm hearing per se. It's about what I'm feeling and how I come away from that a little bit changed. And I come out of there different than when I went in. And I was thinking about this. I just got back from a big trip that I was taking as part of some university work that I was doing overseas. And so I had a chance to visit some amazing places like the Vatican, where you go to the Sistine Chapel. And it's spectacular. I mean, Michelangelo painted that ceiling for 4 years. Or Westminster Abbey in London. I mean, these are amazing, and then there's everywhere you look, there's another amazing cathedral. And I love art and I love all that stuff. But then I went to the Rome Temple, and as beautiful and as amazing it is, it's a different feeling. It's a familiar kind of sweet, motivating spirit that just is different. And that's been my experience, when I go here to Temple or to Provo or whatever, I'm like, there's just something that happens in there. And I can't explain that away psychologically. I mean, maybe I could, but there are experiences like that or other things that I've felt with inspiration that I'm like, I can't find a secular explanation for that. That's something that's deep and important and meaningful to me. So anyway, that's kind of just a quick overview of some of these kinds of experiences that have helped me, even when the bumps come or when it's challenging, it helps me to come back and say, look, I can't separate myself from this, which is so meaningful and so important. I'm a better person when I'm connected to these things. So yeah, that's a big part of my testimony are those experiences.
Thank you for sharing that. When you were talking about your daughter in the MTC and the Book of Mormon, it made me think about something I just read recently from 3 Nephi chapter 1. I was thinking about this, and it says, the prophecies of the prophets began to be fulfilled more fully, for there began to be greater signs and greater miracles wrought among the people. And I thought about how this was speaking about kind of the broad experience of people in general, that these prophecies were being fulfilled. And so there were greater miracles. But I think that phrase is so applicable now individually for each of us, that we can see the prophecies of prophets being fulfilled and experience those personal greater miracles individually in subtle ways, sometimes in small ways that can bless our lives and strengthen us and give us perseverance and perspective.
Yeah. That section of the Book of Mormon is a really interesting one because, the Book of Mormon is for our day, as we, President Benson and others have emphasized. And I just read, speaking of kind of the spiritual secular meeting, I read an article from BYU Studies where they talk about that section being a type for our day, because what you just described, those signs and miracles, some of the people saw those and they dismissed them. They rationalized them. They said, well, some of the things they might have guessed right out of so many, And for me, that's like a perfect example of our day and age of people saying, the temples are just, brainwashing people into paying tithing or whatever it is. I mean, you can always find an explanation if you want to, which is why it comes back to choosing faith is a personal thing. And I think God has let us have that agency, right? We can choose faith. And if we do, our faith will be strengthened. And if we pursue the things that we've been talking about, going to the temple or reading the scriptures or serving others or trying to turn to the atonement in our families, you'll strengthen your faith. But if you don't want to, you don't have to. And you can always find other kinds of explanations. In this day and age, there's lots of negativity and cynicism. You can get swept up in that. So anyway, it's a good example of just what I think we need to be doing.
Given the context of your professional work and thinking about families, we wanted to ask you what your thoughts were related to the law of chastity specifically. We know this is a question related to receiving a temple recommend, and also it's one of the covenants that we make in the temple. And I would just wonder what you would say about how the law of chastity blesses families and relationships.
I see a lot of folks who struggle with various versions of things related to this, whether that's pornography or affairs or whatever. And so that's one just quick evidence for the importance of having a law of chastity. But I'll take it a little broader, which is we live in a world that's very just full of kind of negative, unhealthy things that trigger us. And we are physical beings. We're natural man in a fallen world. So our physical selves are strong and they're made to be strong. And so our physical selves are going to do things like pursue food or reproduction or whatever. And so just to use the food analogy for a second, think about we have more access and more food than ever before. And we struggle with that. Like the whole world, especially Western culture, struggle with being healthy because we have so many things coming at us in the world that are unhealthy. And that's, again, just stuff you see on the media, a billboard of a hamburger or whatever. A few months ago, I was in class, and this is just an example. I wasn't hungry. I didn't need food. And then one of the students brought in this big pan of brownies. And so, of course, all of us, and this is just an example of what our physical selves do. We're like, zero in, the body says, oh, sugar, you should have that. You should go after that. And so if you don't do that, you have to kind of put a little boundary and say, okay, I'm going to choose not to do that. But, I had a brownie. And like I said, I didn't need one. I wasn't hungry. But I thought, that's how it is coming back to the law of chastity. We live in a world that's always triggering people in that regard. And I'm not even just talking about like pornography, which is a serious example of it, but it saturates the world. But just things like social media, which have kind of, lascivious or lewd or inappropriate images or romance novels or whatever, that's just in people's faces all the time. I talk to people regularly who say, I had to take Facebook app off my phone, or I had to take Instagram off. And it's not that those are bad inherently, but it's that stuff will start to get thrown in there. And if anyone stops on any image, those algorithms are like, oh, clearly that was something you wanted to stop on, whether that was, food or a cheerleader. And so anyway, that's the world we live in. Having said all that, we live in that kind of world. We have to figure out how do we keep high standards while living in that world and also not have a lot of shame around the fact that people are going to struggle with that stuff. And I wrote an article in the Liahona about a year ago on this topic because I just think so many people struggle with this idea that I'm being triggered and I'm not perfect. And I would say, yeah, but you are struggling and you have a high standard. So that's good. But yeah, of course, we want to figure out how to live in this world. So the law of chastity helps us keep a perspective on it that is not just about what you do and don't do, but why? Because the doctrine related to it, because our bodies are temples, and because we understand that the atonement, we're bought with a price. We're not even our own, and we're siblings. We love each other as people and not just as objects. So things like that help us be reminded of the importance of this. So again, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think the law of chastity gives us these really important doctrinal foundations for why we do what we do and can help as we make those choices. And again, some people are going to have some pretty big struggles in this area, and some people are going to need and should go and get some professional help. But just know that that's the day and age we're living in, and it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough for a lot of folks out there. And the church has a lot of resources, and there are a lot of resources out there, but being reminded of why we do what we do and having the law of chastity is a good start. It's important.
Do you see the law of chastity providing boundaries and structure that helps families to flourish?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like sets those expectations that you just say, this is the standard that I have. I'm not going to go against that. And so people will be reminded people don't go out and just break the law of chastity, like have an affair one day without having done smaller things that lead up to it. And so it helps people even be reminded, like, watch yourselves and your thoughts and your words and your deeds and be careful. And that's what the law of chastity does. It gives us that structure and that reminder. There's a reason why it's talked about as much as it is, because it's really related to people's happiness and their relationships.
And I really like what you said about remembering that we're all brothers and sisters and thinking of each other in that way. I think that's part of the problem, is when someone views someone as an object instead of a person, that objectification of another individual. And it makes the behaviors that might follow that feel okay or appropriate somehow.
Right. Yep.
This has been so interesting, and I love hearing your perspectives on marriage and family. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on families in general. How do they help us grow? How do we work together to become that eternal, exalted family?
Yeah. As I was saying earlier, in one sense, we're all family because we're part of a heavenly family, and God chooses to be known as our Heavenly Father. I mean, He is our Father, and we have heavenly parents. And so we're all part of that family. In another sense, then we come down to earth in our smaller families. And right away, like, there's a reason I think that families are so important, both doctrinally and just in general, because you get put in this situation with people who are all different, and you have different personalities, you have different values, you have different opinions, and there's different power levels in a family, and there's emotions, and there's close proximity. And that's a recipe for bumps and challenges and sorting through things. And what that does right from the get-go is you start learning things, not just by example, but you also learn how to develop attributes and virtues that are essential for progression, like for eternal progression. So, for example, when you get married, you are with somebody that is different than you. No matter how close you are in background or personality or whatever, you still have differences. And so you're going to have to navigate those. You're going to have to compromise. You're going to have to talk through. You're going to have to be patient. You're going to have to be accepting. You're going to have to be long-suffering, just as one example. If you don't do those things, marriage becomes harder and becomes less pleasant, and people get aggressive and hurtful. If you do those things and you learn to listen to someone else's perspective, you learn that maybe you come across sometimes in ways that are obnoxious, or that you have your blind spots, that's growth. And if you are humble and willing to grow, then you become a better person. And you see those couples, that have been married for 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and you can see the ones that have grown together and have become sweeter and more loving and more connected. And it's because they've done that kind of work. They've said things like, I didn't realize that I was sort of assuming my way was the right way, or that I needed to apologize, or that I'm kind of hard to live with in this way, and then I need to work on that. Those folks have made progress. The ones that have been defensive and not open and blaming, those are the ones that either don't stay together, or they stay together and just become sort of like bitter roommates, or. So I just think families have this role that you can't replace anywhere else. Our relationships are this constant source of learning and of growth. It's like you get one lesson down and here's another one for you. You get one lesson and here's another one. You get different lessons when you have screaming toddlers, and then you get other lessons when you are empty nesters. And anyway, that's just life in families. And so I just think God set that up for a reason. Like He wants us to learn and grow, just like we want our own children to learn and grow. And this is the cauldron to do it in.
Since becoming a mom and watching my children grow, I've really come to believe that within our families, we're given the opportunities that we need for growth.
Yes.
And that comes from what you just talked about as far as our different beliefs, our different personalities, different ways that we love and show love and receive love. Those types of interactions, sometimes even the harder personality traits, I think, or the harder ways in which we learn to love each other. I need that for my own growth. And my child might need something different, but all of those systems work together and come into play.
Yeah. I think everybody in a family learns and grows together. And again, if they're willing and open to learning, I mean, it's, just as one example, it's always unsettling when you see a kid do something that's one of your own flaws, right? Or say something you're like, oh, that's not a good
I know where that came from.
Yeah, that's from me, not my spouse. So, and there's been times like with teenagers that, I've had to say, yeah, I'm frustrated, but I used to be that kid. and maybe April wasn't. She was, I think, a much easier teenager than I was. But, it's those kind of experiences where you're like, I need to give my kid a little slack and just their kids and, or my spouse some slack because I need some slack at times. And so we're all just learning and growing together. And if we can help each other do that, that's a lot better than busting each other's chops along the way.
Yeah, learning to give each other that grace that we want for ourselves. Right. And I think it's interesting from the perspective of parents. I feel like we get these little glimpses of what it might be like to be Heavenly Father a little bit as we watch our children grow and struggle. And we can kind of see the divine design in the plan as they figure things out and we figure things out together.
For sure.
Yeah. And on the flip side, we get glimpses of just greatness, right? Of what maybe it will be like in eternity someday living together as celestial families. We get to see that little glimpse every once in a while, which I know for me, that helps me keep going.
Yep. Yeah, there's a lot of joy mixed in with the work and the trials, but that's why we do it, right? I mean, it's not just because kids are cute and they look like us and say funny things. It's, it's also, there's just joy in the act of creation and in relationships and all that stuff. So it's a good thing.
And I think, like you were saying, when we're humble and willing to learn, that can enhance the joy for sure as we allow our own faults to even maybe be part of the joy as we accept our weakness and try to move past it.
Yeah. Yeah. Give ourselves grace along with everyone else. I think that's an important lesson to learn too.
Definitely. Jason, I know that the last year or so for you, you've experienced quite a bit of personal loss. Your father passed away, and then your brother unexpectedly passed away. And those times of loss, sometimes I feel like can be kind of the furnace of affliction or a training school where we learn things and experience new perspectives. And I'm just interested and wondering what's happened for you through that experience of experiencing their passing and then trying to cope with that and process it after.
Yeah, it is a time when your covenants really take on a different meaning when you experience losses like this. We say, I believe in eternal families, and we do believe that. But then when it comes down to a loss, you have to really say, do I really believe that? Or have I just said that? It's like this rope that I've had. Is it really going to work if I take it and I swing out over this pit? Is it going to keep me up? Is it going to provide for me in that way? And so when we lost Dad, it was hard, but he had been struggling with Alzheimer's for a couple of years. And so we had been losing him by degrees, which was painful. And it was, he was a real sweet guy. And it provided this opportunity to reflect on his influence in my life. And then when he was gone, there was still a jolt, to just not have him there anymore. So that was a loss. And my older brother and I spoke at that funeral. And then the surprise, 5 months later, when suddenly my older brother passed and he was 54, he was not bad health. He just suddenly was gone. And so that really did kind of make me have to turn back to those covenants and think, wow, not having him here, do I know that I'm going to see him again? Or do I just hope that? Have I just told myself that? And I think through a lot of tears and prayers and talking with my family, and there was a lot of comfort that came from those covenants, and even talking to his wife and his sons. So I would just say that's an example of where those covenants became very real and immediate for me as I thought about him, as I would go to the temple, as I would think about his family that's still here, and just how my relationship with him isn't done. It's just sort of on a pause or in a different way right now. And this is kind of sweet that about a week or two ago, one of my sons texted me and he said, I was thinking about Uncle Jeremy. I might even get a little emotional talking about this. He said, I just had this really strong feeling that he's really happy and he's in a good place. And that was really meaningful. And I said, I really appreciate you sharing that. And I shared that with his permission with his wife. And I think it's that sense of knowing where he is and what he's doing now. And he is happy. I mean, he had some ups and downs in his life and some struggles, and to know that he's in a good place right now and he's feeling that peace and rest that is talked about in the scriptures. That's a big source of comfort for me and for his family as well. So that's an example of those covenants becoming a personal strength and something that I'm very grateful for.
That's so meaningful. And I wonder, from your perspective as a family therapist, in processing the passing of a loved one, do you have thoughts or suggestions you would give to someone who might be in that position?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is, you hear things like the stages of grief. You hear the old Elizabeth Kubler-Ross of denial and bargaining and anger and acceptance. And I think those are helpful, but I would also say that it's not always that clean cut. Grief is just your own personal and individual process with whatever loss you're dealing with. And my version is different than someone else's version, and that's okay. That's what I would say. And the other thing I thought about is that it's okay to feel the pain and to feel the loss and to feel, the kind of the sweet but sad feelings, because, if we didn't love, we wouldn't hurt, and we do love. And so it's okay to feel those feelings. And if people get in trouble sometimes when they try not to feel the feelings that they're feeling, and they turn to alcohol or spending or porn or whatever they turn to as an escape, that doesn't solve the problem. It just numbs the problem. And so it's okay to just feel life's, trials when they come at us, and just to kind of just know that that's part of the ups and downs of life. We feel joy in part because we also at times feel pain, and that's all just part of the plan as well.
There is a delicate balance between allowing feelings to overtake us and to leaning into them as appropriate.
Yeah.
And I know I have felt that. I lost both of my parents in my 30s. And while I have to work a lot to not go there too often, sometimes it's very healthy for me to just sit with it and allow myself to feel and experience and remember and love. Like you said, it is a manifestation of our love. It is important to allow ourselves to process and work through that.
Yeah. And some people might need to reach out for help, or, if losses or if grief or if depression becomes too much and, you're having a hard time functioning, it's okay to get help as well. But that's, it's just everybody's version is their version. So you just kind of work with what you got.
Jason, how would you encourage someone to arise with Christ?
I would say, for me, that means turning to Christ in some of the ways we've talked about, through his words, through the scriptures, through our covenants, through worship, through prayer. These are all the normal answers. But for me, I think about it, and I know I've kind of talked about this in a couple of different ways. When we do those things, it's like we are filling up our souls with good things, with nourishment, with spiritual strength. And the result of that is, the output of that is that we're going to feel differently. We're going to be more Christ-like ourselves, and we are going to be better people in our relationships and in, our lives. And that's different than when we turn to the world, because if you fill your soul with worldly stuff, the output is going to be different. It's going to be worldly types of output, or just feeling differently. And I'm not saying you can't ever be a part of the world or watch TV or use social media or whatever, but I'm saying we should be careful, just in the same way we talked about like junk food earlier. I'm not saying you can't ever have Halloween candy or junk food, but if that's your main diet, I had a friend who, she said, in college, I lived for 2 years on Twizzlers and Diet Coke.
Why not?
I think I had friends who did that too.
And she said, I wasn't feeling very good. And I was like, what a surprise. Your physical body needs nourishment, and there's no nourishment in those things. she mentioned, just in the same way that our souls need nourishment. And I just know that when I turn to these sources of spiritual nourishment, I just feel differently. I want different things. I'm a different person. And so for me, arising with Christ is like going to that source of his strength, of his atonement. And, I think I could do better at that. But when I am doing better at that, I'm a better person. I'm a happier person. I'm better in my families, and I'm better just personally, professionally, everything. So it's just a good reminder, and it's a good question to ponder.
We are grateful that you joined us today. We would love to hear your stories about how you arise with Jesus Christ. You can find us on Instagram at arise.with.christ or email us at arisewithchrist.temples@gmail.com.